Thank you guys so much for coming. This has been such a fun event to put together over the course of this series, and I'm especially looking forward to this one. It's pretty special that we kind of had this idea. Well, I really wanted to do nationalism in education, and then I learned that the journal that SEN was doing nationalism in education special issue, and that kind of just spurred me on to reach out even more. So I'm really happy to have you guys here. So I think we've all had this conversation one-on-one, but what I was thinking was we'd just take about 20 minutes each and have all three papers, and then questions and discussion at the end. And yeah, I guess just thank you to SEN for inspiring my seniors.
And Kristen for all the work in organizing this.
Whenever you're ready.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much to the organizers for having me here. Today I'm talking about identity politics in the education system in South Tyrol. And I'm looking at the educational system on the one hand side from the point of view of identity building, and on the other hand from the point of view of an instrumental, from an instrumental point of view, namely the transfer of knowledge, and in particular the establishment or the building up of language skills. So in order to do so, I choose an educational system that needs to deal with different or multiple cultures and languages. Can you hear me? I have very slow voice. Okay, so I choose an educational system that needs to deal with different cultures and different languages. And I would like to reflect, first of all, on the relationship between multiple cultures and multiple languages. And in my particular case, I'm looking at the relationship between the cultures and languages of national historical minorities and the cultures and languages of migration-generated minorities. And I'm looking at this relationship first from a theoretical point of view, and then I'm looking at it from a very empirical point of view, namely I'm presenting you the case study of South Tyrol. I don't know how familiar you are with South Tyrol, but South Tyrol is a territory in the north of Italy, bordering Austria and Switzerland. And until World War I, this territory has been part of the Habsburg Empire and was more than 90% German-speaking. And there are two small groups of Latin speakers. The Latin speakers, or Latin is an old Greco-Roman language that is also spoken nowadays in Switzerland. So until World War I, it was German-speaking plus this Latin minority. And after World War I, it became part of Italy because of the change of the borders. And this period between World War I and World War II, but then slightly also after World War II, was characterized by forced assimilation of the Italian state. So they tried to Italianize the German speakers and the Latin speakers. And they had these three steps. First, they tried to forbid to speak the language, the German language, in the public life, and then afterwards also in private life. That means that they obviously couldn't speak German anymore in private administration, in the courts, but they were also not able to speak Italian because they simply couldn't speak it. The Italian state closed the German schools and introduced Italian schools. This didn't really work out so well, so they forbid the German language also in private life. That means that people had to change their names, so from Johann, for example, they became Giovanni and so on. In a second step, the state facilitated mass migration from other Italian regions to this German-speaking territory to increase the number of Italian speakers in the territory. And as a last step, there was a deal between Hitler and Mussolini that said that if the population wanted to remain German, they had to emigrate, and they would be given some small land in Germany or in the Reich. Or if they wanted to stay, they would need to become Italian. Luckily, this last step was not implemented because the war was over, so most of the population remained within Italy, and Italy was forced after World War II to grant an autonomy and to protect the German and Latin minority in this territory. So nowadays, this territory has a large legislative and administrative autonomy. There are group rights given to the German and the Latin minority, and there are also personal rights to protect those languages and cultures. And we have today around 500,000 people living there. 65% of them are German speakers, 25 or 26% Italian speakers, and as I said, 4% are Latin speakers. I said already that they have now a very far-ranging autonomy and they're well protected. The full, both languages, German and Italian, are equal, and there is in many parts a bilingual system, so bilingual. There's a bilingual media. There are two media systems. There's a school, or there are two parallel school systems. I will come back on that soon. And all the three groups are equally represented in the public administration and also in the government. So we could say that nowadays there's a quite peaceful living together of these three linguistic groups. And now, since 15-20 years, there is, as everywhere in Europe, an increasing influx of population or of people from other parts of the world. And currently we have 9% of non-Italian citizens. We in Italy still talk about non-Italian citizens because their migration history is very short, so naturalization has not yet occurred. Out of those 44,000 or 9% of migrants, the main groups are Albanians, Germans from Germany, Moroccans, and Pakistani. But however, those 44,000 people are very diverse, and there are nowadays more than 140 different languages spoken, and those 44,000 people come from more than 130 nations. So we could say that the territory is nowadays a highly diverse territory, and in particular there are these three historical groups living there: the Italian speakers, German speakers, and Latin speakers, and now also these migration-generated groups. And we could talk about this coming together of the two different groups. Some authors talk about it in terms of old minorities and new minorities, or minority within minority. We could also say there is now a super diversity that has been not created, but we can find a super diversity in the territory. And Banting and Soroka, for example, talk about this challenge that comes from this super diversity. As on the one hand, a challenge that is the minority nationalism, so the traditional minorities or historical minorities want to protect their identity and preserve it. And on the other hand, there is immigrant multiculturalism, so the necessity or the wish of the migrant-generated minorities to effectively participate in society and become fully integrated in the society. If we then come to the educational system as one dimension where these different groups and different interests come together, we could argue that first of all there are different aims that are followed by the historical national minorities. So in particular the German and Latin speakers, their main aim is to preserve and to preserve and maintain their own culture and language. And that is also the first aim that they bring in the educational system. So they want an educational system where they can keep their German language. And then learning different languages in order to participate in a greater society or in order to be more competitive is only on a second, is the second most important aim. When we talk about the participation in a wider society, we also have to ask, what does it mean for the German speakers, the wider society? Is it the Italian state where they want to participate, so they will need to learn Italian? Or is it, for example, the German area, that is Austria, Germany, Switzerland, where they want to participate? So they would then, in that case, not necessarily need to speak or to be very fluent in Italian. So that is already a question. But then if we think of other national minorities, like for example the Corsicans, and if we ask where they want to participate, then the question is a bit more difficult, because Corsican, they can speak only on the island, but if they want to participate in a wider society, they necessarily need to speak either French or wherever they want to orientate themselves. If we now look at the migration-generated minorities, in particular the first and maybe also second generation of migrants, their first aim is not to preserve their own cultural identity, but they want to integrate in a society and participate effectively. So the question is now, if they are living in, or if they are in South Tyrol, where to integrate? Integrate in a German-speaking society or area, or to orient themselves towards the Italian world. Since they're living in a state, in the Italian state, one could say there's greater mobility within one state if they participate in the Italian-speaking area. If they maybe are oriented towards Germany, Austria, they would probably prefer the German world. And then the preservation of their own cultural identity for them obviously is not the first aim they bring in the educational system, but that comes on the second. That comes only in second place. So if we now look at South Tyrol, first of all, we have to know that in the autonomy system there is one important article, that is Article 19, and that says that every linguistic group, so the Ladins, the German speakers, the Italian speakers, have the right, or each group has the right to be educated in the mother tongue by teachers of the mother tongue. And that has led in South Tyrol to the establishment of 3 parallel systems. So we have what I call now the German system, that is the language of the instruction is German, and Italian is taught as any other subject, like mathematics, like physics, like English, for example. So there is no special role of Italian. Then there is the parallel Italian speaking system. The language of instruction is Italian. All the subjects are taught in Italian, and there is then teaching of German and English. And then there is the Latin system, but that is only implemented in 2 small valleys, where there is teaching in the language of instruction is German and Italian, and Latin is taught as a subject. And besides these 3 educational systems, there are also then 3 advisory bodies: the German one, the Italian one, the Latin one, and 3 educational authorities. So you could imagine this as really 3 separate pillars, and they obviously follow all the national guidelines, national Italian guidelines in terms of how many school years you need to do, how many hours you need to teach, and so on and so forth. But also the curricula are similar but not the same. For example, or in particular in relation to the teaching of cultural subjects like literature. So in the German system, obviously the German literature is taught, whereas in the Italian system, Italian one. And also they differ in regard of history teaching. So which history and which perspective is taught. This parallel system creates some problems, in particular for those families. We call them mixed families, that is families where one parent is, for example, from the German minority, one from the Italian group, because they then obviously have to choose. And then it's difficult how to choose whether to send the children in German school or Italian school. And this parallel system creates now also some problem for immigrant or migrant parents, because they are not affiliated to any of the systems, and they really either consciously choose or they happen to be in one system and then they cannot come out anymore. So parents can freely choose where to send their children. So either, even if, for example, my children don't speak Italian, I can send them to the Italian school, so that's no problem. But it is not appreciated, although not forbidden, to switch. So you cannot go for 1 year there. Well, you can in theory, but it's not appreciated by the authorities. In South Tyrol, as I said, there's this parallel system from kindergarten to high school, and there's now, since 10 years, also a university, which is called the Free University of Bolzano, and that's the exception to the system because it's a trilingual university. There's German, Italian, and English, and all the subjects are taught in all 3 languages. So it might happen that you have some courses in Italian, some courses in German, and every student is obliged to speak the 3 languages at the end of his career, and also professors are obliged to have some knowledge of all the 3 languages. So that is that. But now the question is, what do migrants do? Where do they send their children, and what problems or challenges do they face when they enter the educational system in South Tyrol? And first, I don't know if you are familiar with, or I don't know if you're familiar with the rules that the Italian state has set up in order to integrate migrant children in the educational system. So they need to be followed in South Tyrol as well. And that is an integrated approach, which means that children do not go in separate classes, but they are immediately integrated from the first day of school in the, let's say, the normal school classes. Also, if, for example, a family moves during the school year from Pakistan to South Tyrol, let's say, or to Italy, and the children can then immediately go to the school without prior knowledge of any language. Once they are in school, they are allocated to the class according to their age, and then they are given cultural mediators and special language trainers that accompany them during the school year and try to teach them the language and try to help them catching up with the rest of the class. Now in South Tyrol, this is, as I said, valid as in the rest of Italy, but then in South Tyrol, parents need to choose whether they want to send them in the German system or Italian system. And traditionally, most of the migrant parents send their pupils in the Italian system. Why so? Because many came from Albania. I said Albanians are the biggest group residing in South Tyrol, and there is a cultural vicinity between Albanians and Italians. But also because many migrants live in and around the capital of Bolzano, and the capital happens to be mainly Italian-speaking, whereas the rural area is mainly German-speaking. So most of the migrant children were in the Italian school, but this has now shifted since a few years, and now it seems that parents choose much more consciously the German school for their children. Why so? Because they say that, well, there's a study, and in this study, more than 70% of all migrants say that they think German is much more important to live well in South Tyrol. That's why they choose the German school system for their children. However, they were then also asked if they are happy with the school system or whether they would prefer a different school system. 1/3 of all migrant parents said that they would prefer a bilingual or a mixed system, not having to choose. Yeah. As I didn't say before, but I said most of the migrant children were in Italian schools, but Italian schools are there are fewer Italian schools than German schools, so the impact migrant children are having on Italian schools is much higher. So they're now, in 2012, I think the number was 20% of all children in Italian schools were from migrant families, whereas in the German system, which is much larger, much more children, the impact was only 6%, although the numbers were equal, or even in the German system, maybe some more. So I said already, the migrant perspective, they think the German language is much more important, but they would prefer a mixed system. If we now come to the perspective of the German speakers, they themselves have always, since the end of World War II, perceived a mixed system or bilingual school system as the biggest threat to their culture, because after World War I, the German school was closed, and they couldn't really preserve their language in school anymore. So they always felt the school system needs to be separated, otherwise we will immediately lose our language and our culture. But then, now they also perceive migration as one of the very big threats to their language and culture, because they think that many migrants are affiliating themselves to the Italian language group, so the Italian group will be stronger in terms of numbers. So there's a double threat that they perceive now. Mixed school system that is promoted by migrant parents and migrants themselves that want to enter, or that are entering the South Tyrol society, and that could strengthen the Italian group. So there has been a law in 2011 that says once there are more than 30% of migrant pupils in a class, the municipality needs to take care of them and allocate them to different schools. So that basically there's a quota of 30% migrant children. That is one rather restrictive measure, but there's a second measure that is very interesting, and that is the setting up of an institution that is responsible for the organization and for the better coordination of integration of migrant children in schools. And this institution is not allocated to one of the three pillars, so neither to the German or the Italian or the Latin system, but it is one of the very few and first, one would say, intergroup or cross-group institutions. So that is a novelty. And I think it's a big sign, in particular, of the German group, if they have always perceived migration as a threat and the collaboration with the Italian speakers in the educational system as a threat, if they now set up one common institution to organize this migrant, the integration of migrant children. And now we could also look at the linguistic skills. So how, once the migrant children are in school, do they effectively learn German? What happens with the Italian? Or don't they learn any language of the two? And by doing so, I would again like to compare what happens with the German-speaking children in school. Do they learn the Italian language, or do they learn the German language? Can they maintain and preserve the German identity? So the parallel education system, it has been argued, often creates also parallels in society. So there is very low contact between the groups, and in that sense the German speakers are able to maintain their own culture and language within their own group. But as I said, there is very little contact to the Italian speakers, and there's many studies, but one of the recent ones from 2011 that says that there's nowadays a very negative attitude towards the other Italians, and that negative attitude is also a historical ballast for the language learning, which results in very low linguistic skills of the German speakers in the Italian language, due to, as I said, this negative attitude. And the same is true for the Italian speakers when we look at their linguistic skills, we look at their German skills. And pupils with migration background, as I said at the beginning, they have to, or they are faced with these two languages, and they need to decide what to learn first, where to become more fluent. So that seems as a double barrier at the beginning, because once they have learned German, they also need to learn some Italian, and the other way around. But there are studies that show that those migrant children, they don't have this ideological bias towards any of the languages, and so they learn the languages much quicker and much easier. And in the end, they are more fluent in the two languages than the historical or the autochthonous population itself. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Russian video.
Alright. Next up should be Stuart. University of Aberdeen. Sorry, I should be first to Verena is from the University of Leicester. And what's the Minority Rights Center?
Yes, there's a private research center called Durkin Academy in Montana, and that is, well, there's an institute called Minority Rights Institute, and we mainly deal with minority rights, but mainly also in South Tyrol. Please.
Well, I'd also like to thank the Association for the invitation. I'd like to also thank the journal editors. It was a pleasure to deal with journal editors. It's not always the case. I'd like to thank Kristen for making the arrangements today. The article in the journal came out of doctoral research that was conducted between 2007 and 2011. The fieldwork for that research took place in 2009. Since then, the social and political context in the Basque Country has altered quite radically, and amongst other developments, you know, we'd have to point to the traction that appears to have been gained by ETA's ceasefire of 20th of October 2011. So the situation's moved on markedly since this research was carried out. However, this research, in a way, anticipated these developments and focused on constructive developments in the realm of education and human rights, which predated this ceasefire by a number of years. And the research honed in particular on a new educational policy in the Basque Country, the Basque Education Plan for Peace and Human Rights, which was to be rolled out initially for a period of 4 years between 2008 and 2011. I say rolled out. At the time in which I conducted research and the objectives of this first 4-year period would be very much concerned with putting in place the infrastructure for this permanent policy development as it goes forward. So this is a broad-based educational policy concerned with the promotion of peace culture in the Basque Country. Obviously, there is not time here to go into the whys and wherefores of the development of Basque nationalism, the so-called Basque conflict. Suffice to say, the numbers of people killed, maimed by ETA, the numbers of people killed by the Spanish authorities, tortured by the Spanish authorities, people killed by right-wing paramilitary groups is evidence enough and attests to the fact that there has been and continues to be a social and political conflict in the Basque Country. My aims are pretty modest here. I'm really just speaking to the paper, speaking to the published article. I'll provide a little bit of context for the development of the plan. I'll focus then a little bit on the political fallout during the initial period in which I was conducting the research. The research is kind of inevitable with a lot of research around the Basque Country, ends up getting pretty involved in the politics around whatever it is, be it an educational policy or whatever. Despite this, the political fallout which I'll identify, I'll go on to end on a positive note, and I'll suggest, as I do in the published article, that despite the caustic nature of this debate, the plan advances the cause of peace building in this context. So this plan was approved by the Basque Parliament in December of 2007, but it was actually one strand of a much bigger policy, a much broader policy, which was called Peace and Coexistence. It had 6 strands, and the educational, the plan to bring forward a policy in peace, education and human rights was but one of these 6 strands. When this policy was initially presented in 2006 by a Basque nationalist controlled government in the wake of a previous ceasefire by ETA, it was presented very much as a contribution to a peace process. mistakenly, misguidedly, in my view. This policy, in my view, was in fact a long overdue response to criticisms that have been levelled at successive Basque governments by a number of Basque civil society groups who'd alleged that Basque governments had been indifferent to the plight of the victims of terrorism in the Basque country. A number of these civil groups had also been working for a number of years in peace education and in human rights education, and they'd been campaigning for a number of years for an educational policy of this kind. Internationally, this plan also responded to the United Nations Declaration of a Culture of Peace in 1999. But I don't want to suggest that the Basque government or successive Basque governments have been somehow immune to developing policies in this area. In fact, Basque governments had been developing policies in peace education, human rights education, since the early 1990s. However, evaluations, reviews of this work identifies that much of this work was characterised by very poor coordination between Basque civil society and the Basque government. There was a great deal of duplication of efforts, poor evaluation, little sense overall of what was being achieved. Perhaps most damningly of all, even when peace education was introduced into the formal school system, into the classrooms of the Basque country, it failed to confront the conflict closest to home. But I don't think the Basque country would be unique in that sense. The literature suggests that in the early phases of work of this kind, that teachers find it much easier to talk about other conflicts on the global scale, any conflict, rather than the conflict closest to home. Unlike previous policies, however, this plan was designed to be permanent. And at its heart lay a coordinating forum between the Basque government and Basque civil associations, many of whom had developed a great deal of expertise in peace education and human rights education strategies and interventions. And this coordinating forum goes on to draw in some 32 Basque civil forums into this coordinating model with the Basque government. That's 31 or 32 civil associations who are broadly said to be working in the field of peace education and human rights. In terms of investment, scope, objectives, it's undoubtedly the most significant policy ever developed in this area by a Basque government. It contained an all-encompassing educational philosophy so that the actions it devised would be targeted not only at the formal school system, but also at public media, at civil servants, in the police, the judiciary, in the prisons system. According to the principal architect of this plan, John Lander, the plan represented, and I quote, a coordinated and systematic attempt to extend a culture of human rights and peace throughout the whole of Basque society, end quote. The aim was, open quotes, to bring about a change of attitude in broad sectors of the population, greater awareness, a deepening of the culture of human rights and peace in citizens and in institutions. Given the highly sensitive nature of this policy, however, and the entrenched ethno-national fissures in Basque society, it was always likely to light the political touch paper. And that's exactly what happened. The usual zero-sum debate ensued. For the parties of the opposition, that's to say the Socialist Party, the Conservative Party, political parties who are associated very much with Spanish statewide parties, to say non-Basque nationalist parties. For these political parties and some civil society groups from within the forum who shared this perspective, this plan proceeded from a diagnosis of the political situation in the Basque Country, which was Basque nationalist in orientation. The plan's aim to delegitimise terrorist violence was seized upon by critics from within this same political perspective, who argued that this all-encompassing peace and human rights discourse within the plan served to place the activities of ETA on the same moral plane as domestic violence, as bullying in schools. From within the Basque nationalist community, the most contentious element of the plan was a school pilot. So remember, the plan is still very much in the developmental stage. These peace-building discourses have not been rolled out in the formal school system yet. So the materials were devised, didactic units were devised with which to approach the school system. This proved to be highly contentious, perhaps the most contentious element of this plan during the time which I was conducting this research. The aim of the pilot was to approach the schools of the Basque Country with these didactic units, which had been devised by a couple of the civil society associations that have been working in this area, with the aim of improving student sensitivity towards the victims of terrorism. This immediately descended into the usual internecine politics over the nature of this conflict, over the very nature of a victim. Who will be represented in these didactic units? Who will be the victims? Will the victims only be victims of ETA? Will the victims, will material related to victims who were victims of right-wing Spanish paramilitary groups also be introduced? But more than a highly contentious debate over content, there was also a furious political debate over methodology. The socialist and conservative politicians and civil society associations wanted the victims of terrorism to be able to give direct testimony within the classrooms of the Basque Country. They argued that this would be extremely powerful in raising students' sensitivity. Basque nationalists argued against this. The architect of the plan, John Lander, rather famously said that he felt that taking the direct testimony of victims into the classrooms would be, and I quote, too abrupt. Successful peace education of this kind, however, is about more than just policy. It requires a conducive societal political context. In the absence of a conducive context, it's inevitable that a more circumspect model initially will be developed. It's probably also inevitable that political battles of this kind will be waged in the initial phase. Peace education, which deals with human rights in broad terms, such as the plan as it was initially devised, is said to conform to an indirect model of peace education. But I said I'd like to round up by suggesting that despite this debate, despite the highly politicised and contentious nature of the debate which was associated with the development of this plan, I argue in the article that this should not be allowed to detract from some of the social and political gains which I believe to have accrued. The very existence of this permanent policy in such a highly charged political context is in itself a cause for celebration. Along with more recent policies, this plan addresses a moral and ethical lacuna at the heart of Basque public policy making. John Lander's greatest fears were that the politics of which I'm speaking would come to define the work of the Forum of Civil Associations, that the Forum of Civil Associations within which all of these political perspectives were represented would descend into political warfare, that the Forum would not survive this process. That was one of his fears. This has proven to be unfounded. The Forum is still in existence, and its work has very much been consolidated. Despite the highly contentious debate around the pilot phase in taking these didactic units into the formal school system in the Basque Country, subsequent to the pilot, there have been sophisticated evaluations of these of the pilot phase by a respected academic in the Basque University, and these evaluations attest to the ability of these materials to raise students' sensitivity towards victims of terrorism. The plan has now survived 2 changes of government. This has inevitably led to reformulations. In 2009, the Basque Nationalist Party, which had enjoyed an erstwhile hegemony over the public institutions of the Basque Country, was forced into opposition for the first time by a coalition between the Socialists and the Conservative Party in the Basque Country. Because this plan had been so highly contentious and featured in the election process, it was inevitable that once in government, this new coalition would immediately set about remodelling the plan, and this they did, and they immediately set about remodelling the plan along more direct peace education lines that say to openly confronting the nature of the conflict in the Basque Country in a way in which policy, as initially devised, have not. So as I said, the initial 4-year plan was aimed at creating this infrastructure in order that it should become a permanent policy. This appears to be the case. Indeed, it would now appear, although I'm not on top of the detail at the moment, although I intend to be going back to the Basque Country at Easter, it would now appear that the direct testimony of victims is being given in some of the Basque schools, that victims received a lot of training before going into the Basque schools, so we can say that consensus has developed to a degree there. Finally, the fact that the societal political conditions are now markedly altered since the time in which this research is carried out is likely to lead to the development of further consensus in this area, as Basque society turns its attention away from what's to be done about ETA and focuses more on the long road towards reconciliation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Last but not least, we have Professor Sarah Radcliffe and Dr. Andrew Webb from Cambridge.
Thank you very much. Again, I'd like to thank Kirsten for making all of the arrangements and to the journal for the opportunity to make our work more widely known among people who are doing fascinating work in different parts of the world. I'm going to start our presentation and then I'll pass it to Andrew, and we hope that works. So our project comes out of a 3-year ESRC project in which we are specifically focusing on the nature of the education experience for Mapuche young people between the ages of 14 and 18 approximately. But of course, in the context in which we started the research in 2011, it was very clear that education was an extremely contentious field and galvanizing a lot of civil society organizations in response to some of the processes that have been underway in Chile for a number of years. And so, although I'll tell you a little bit about the project, and the way in which we link it with some of the debates going on in Latin America around ethnic conflict with the state and the ways in which various different policies, including educational policy, are being adapted to that context. Andrew will then pick up and tell you a specific history of the relationship between Mapuche demands for certain kinds of education and the broader student movements. Okay, so this is an ESRC project drawing very much on critical development geographies and sociologies of youth, which is Andrew's area of expertise. We started in July 2011, and we're looking, as I said before, on the way in which education is a window onto the nature of relationships between different groups, primarily the indigenous population of Mapuche, we'll talk about a bit more in a minute, and the powers that be, represented by the state, and the opportunities for negotiations around citizenship, around rights, around identity and belonging, particularly for this generational cohort who we see as being positioned in quite an interesting moment. On the one hand, they are moving into secondary education and working with young people in secondary education establishments, unlike their parents or grandparents who weren't able to extend their education into that level of education. But this is also occurring at a moment when in Chile the numbers of people going into higher education is of course growing dramatically, but where there is also a highly contentious politics between particularly Mapuche indigenous people and the state, which has been expressed in a number of different quite dramatic events, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the fieldwork is very qualitative. It's very much looking at these wider issues from the perspective of people who are at the sort of forefront of these educational spaces and at the forefront of the experience of living through these historic moments. And so our fieldwork involved a lot of interviews with the young people, focus groups in which we were working, trying to elicit sort of their ways of talking about the issues that they were facing as young Mapuche secondary pupils, also with teachers, school directors, local Ministry of Education officials, and so on, examining both educational policy in the national curriculum, but exploring too the ways in which intercultural bilingual education has become a core element of primary school education in areas where Indigenous people are a majority, but also in some cases going into secondary education. So we're working in this particular part of southern Chile here, south of Santiago. This is, Chile is divided up into 9 regions, and so this is number 9 from the north. So it shows you it's quite far south. And this is a region which is a political administrative region, but it does also overlay what was historically the center of Mapuche residents in the pre-Columbian era. And their populations also extended the other side of the Andes into what is now Argentina. Through the course of the 19th century, then the Chilean state started pushing against that, what was effectively a frontier, and after 1880 started to establish force and military presence in what were the historic Mapuche territories, putting Mapuche populations into what are effectively reservations, and selling off land or awarding land to European settlers or Chilean settlers from elsewhere in the country. So this is an area which is now, it's very difficult to get the statistics on the ethnic makeup of this particular region, but in the country as a whole, indigenous populations account for about 11% of the total national population, and Mapuche are the largest of all of those groups. The other groups that are indigenous are found in the very far north near Bolivia. And although there's been a large migration of Mapuche into Santiago and into other urban districts, this area remains the area with the highest concentration and numbers of rural Mapuche. And it's characterized by lower incomes, lower wages, poorer educational outcomes, poorer healthcare, and so on, than elsewhere in the country. Now, the dynamic between a dominant Spanish-descended group and the indigenous populations in Latin America have, of course, played out in very interesting ways over recent decades. And the dynamic, as it's being interpreted now very widely, is a dynamic between, on the one hand, the pressure for recognition under a form of multiculturalism, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a set of policies associated with neoliberalism, broadly speaking, which are reconfiguring the ways in which redistribution occurs. Okay. So many scholars looking at Latin America understand the dynamic between education, ethno-political conflict, and the state, and in relation to those different components. So on the one hand, you have, as in Chile, you have a neoliberal political philosophy making a huge difference in terms of the kinds of education that's on offer, the degree to which the market is brought into the educational system, and also very importantly, the construction of particular forms of citizenship and belonging which are related back to neoliberalism. Forms of consumerism, forms of belonging, sort of outward-looking global subjectivity, if you like, which is associated with neoliberalism. Now, of course, Chile, in a Latin American context, was very early to adopt these neoliberal mantras, and it did so under Pinochet, and did so unopposed. Civil society organizations had little traction against the application of these measures. And so, as an example of this policy, there was a national voucher scheme which encouraged the privatization of the educational system. Now, the story, as it's been told, is very much a story about the class stratification that resulted from that educational voucher scheme, but we want to come back in our research to look at some of the sort of racial consequences of that. And so the return to democracy was associated with measures to continue, but to moderate those neoliberal measures. But at the same time, there was, as had occurred earlier in the rest of Latin America, there was a move to try and recognize the multicultural diversity of the country. And it did so through a number of different legal measures, which also established the basis for education to be, in certain schools, in certain places, intercultural and bilingual. And as the slide indicates, there is, of course, a number of different legislative moments through which that change has occurred. And I think that for the context of our meeting here today, I think it's very important to recognize the sort of Chile's exceptionalism for a number of different reasons. One is that the multicultural reforms introduced in Chile, including in education, were carried out not because of the strength of an indigenous movement demanding that as part of a set of cultural rights, but rather a sense of a concession being made in light of a sort of wider global understanding of the need to incorporate that. That's not to say, however, and Andrew will go on talking about this, that there hasn't been very particular mobilizations by Mapuche and other indigenous people to try and change the educational system. But these factors, very early neoliberalism and very late concessionary interculturalism and bilingual educational introduction, do have a very particular impact on the way in which young people can envisage themselves as taking part in a vibrant multicultural society or in an intercultural space, which is also one of our interests. So if I pass over to you.
Well, to move things along, I think most people here will know something about the 2011 to 2013 student movement in Chile. It received, in terms of global press, an awful lot of coverage. What will be less known are the prior movements, 2001, 2006, Mochilazo and the Penguin Revolution. These really map out three significant but interlinked and progressive protests led by mostly secondary level education pupils, and then from 2011 largely university cohort. But it's significant that there was growing unrest amongst the school populations and the university populations about the neoliberal effects on education that Sarah's just described. And as you can see there, they grew in size and in coverage, and also in the politicized nature of the claims and the demands that were being made. So eventually, the 2011 to 2013 protests have really they gained enormous support within civil Chilean society. There was an enormous amount of public support shown for the students, despite often being caught on camera that the police forces rather heavy-handed responses to these. But effectively, they were challenging not just the education system, which the previous two demands and movements have been making, but they actually went on to challenge the neoliberal and political model of the country. And it was very evident, and they made it very explicit. The leaders of the student movement made it very explicit that one of the central problems of Chilean society is the socio-economic division that education is set up to produce. So the OECD has been very explicit about the manner in which these divisive forms of education are affecting Chilean society, and that they're effectively undemocratic. And what gets a lot less exposure is the racialized and socio-cultural aspects of the Chilean education system. So that's effectively what we've tried to map out a little bit here. Often there were Mapuche students and Mapuche secondary school pupils involved in those three movements that we've just described, but perhaps they didn't get the kind of recognition that the mass-scale movements did. But as you can see from the screen there are clear racialized inequalities within the Chilean education system. I won't go into those anymore just because of the amount we've got to get through. But ethnic demands for a culturally appropriate education have actually existed for an extremely long time. From the early 20th century, we get a diversity of different Mapuche organizations who are attempting to engage with politics at the time about the appropriateness of the education system. Now, the thing to note about the Mapuche organizations is that it hasn't been, like in other parts of Latin America where there's been one very solidified, coordinated movement, there have been numerous organizations and no one particular positionality taken by the organizations as a whole. So, for example, as we outlined in the paper, you've got the Sociedad Caupolicana Defensora de la Araucanía making some claims which were quite integrationist. You know, they were saying, actually, the Mapuche just need more access to schools. We're isolated. They were placed on reservations following military defeat. Whereas the Federación Araucana was saying, we want our own schools. We want an autonomous schooling system. You know, this is inadequate that we should be assimilated into Chilean society. There was still a very strong sense of being a Mapuche nation at that time, having enjoyed autonomy under the Spanish rule. So then the debate continues on. You find from around 1935 ideas being developed among particular conferences, Mapuche teachers organising into particular unions, and developing ideas for how to influence the education system and how they could make it more equitable. And particularly the integrationist angle on education was about grants and housing. So the grants would provide financial incentives and financial help for Mapuche pupils and students to go to the cities where most of the schools were located and to be able to study, and provide them with the housing in order to be able to do so. Whereas you have on the other side of the argument those saying, no, we need more autonomous schools, we need more schools built on the reservations in order to be able to push forward our own particular forms of education. It's famously said, we have our own education, it's just that we're being schooled differently. So what you find is then the state begin to intervene and respond to a certain number of these claims, but particularly those that are favoured towards integration. So you have school food vouchers, housing and grants increasing in numbers during the 1970s particularly, and even during the dictatorship, and especially now following the return to democracy. A number of different programmes, particularly P900, for example, looked at the 900 schools with the worst test scores and dedicated particular funds towards those. And finally, and most famously, the intercultural bilingual education system. Now, Sarah alluded to before that it's very much goes unrecognised the amount of input that that Mapuche demands had for the creation of the intercultural bilingual education. Rather, it tends to be seen as a concession given by the state to appease these kinds of demands, global demands for multiculturalism. So we find that intercultural bilingual education is established from the year 2000. It's very significant that this input of money from Programa Orígenes, approximately $6 million went into the development of intercultural bilingual education in Chile. That occurred at precisely the same time as ethnic conflict was at its peak. So precisely at that moment, the Chilean government invests this money together with a loan from the Inter-American Bank. And today, well, we see a number of primary schools, 350 approximately in the Araucanía region, and at the time when we were conducting the fieldwork, about 5 secondary schools. Here's just one, there isn't time, of course, so we just included one opinion of a Mapuche who was involved in these processes of IBE. And there you can see what our interviewee thought of this type of the concessions being offered, and the difficulty of the fit that currently exists between IBE and this Western logic that still prevails within the school setting.
Right. We thought we'd better talk to the particular kind of cohort or the youth group that we're particularly interested in, and tell you just very briefly about how they've been involved in these movements to both push them right to various different forms of education for Mapuche populations. And the other thing also to highlight is that although, as Andrew suggested, there were housing projects for rural Mapuche to come into the cities to become educated, sometimes those houses didn't act necessarily as spaces for assimilation, but actually they acted as spaces for politicization. And so the unexpected sort of outcomes of some of those processes. And another continuing strand, I think, that we can see, both from the sort of early 20th century, 100 years ago, roughly from now, we can also see that the certain individual Mapuche who have succeeded in continuing through education into higher education or into professional education are often then the spokespeople and very important leaders of various different movements and the demands for change within this. So there is also, despite the general pattern of Mapuche having poor educational outcomes than Chileans, there are some highly educated individuals who have been very important in trying to push for change across the educational sector as a whole. In the most recent protests that we highlighted in the article, we have had organizations of indigenous youth, Mapuche youth, becoming involved in and coordinating actions, and also putting pressure on the national university student union or the confederation to include their demands. And that's been a struggle to put in a sort of an indigenous set of concerns into an indigenous student movement, which prior to that was largely concerned with that socioeconomic stratification rather than with questions around ethno-cultural difference. And I think that's probably it. If anybody wants to, we have a little bit about Bachelet and what she might want to do, but we'll leave that for questions.
The Association for the Study of Ethnicity and Nationalism is an interdisciplinary student-led research association founded by research students and academics in 1990 at the London School of Economics and Political Science. We seek to fulfil two broad objectives: to facilitate and maintain an interdisciplinary global network of researchers, academics and other scholars interested in ethnicity and nationalism, and to stimulate, produce and diffuse world-class research on ethnicity and nationalism. We do this through our global membership, our two leading journals, Nations and Nationalism and Studies in Ethnicity and Nationalism, our newsletter, The Ruritanian, which provides key updates on information in the field, and through our programme of events. Our YouTube channel features videos from our annual conferences, seminar series, lectures and debates. You can find us online at lse.ac.uk/ASEN, on Twitter at ASEN Events, or on Facebook at facebook.com/ASEN Events.